I'm Miriam Tucker. On behalf of my partners, David Rago and Suzanne Perro, I'd like to welcome you all here tonight for our talk by Derek Ostergard, and I'd also like to welcome you on behalf of the entire staff of Rago, including the jewelry department and the Great Estates department, coins and currency, that have set up these beautiful sales. Can you hear me all right? Yeah? Okay. Before we get going with Derek's talk, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what's coming up. On January 13th, we're holding a panel called Out with the Old and In with the New Year. It's about removing unneeded, unwanted possessions from your home and life as quickly, usefully, and in some case profitably as possible. And that'll be on January 13th, it's a panel. Then on February 23rd, our own phenomenal Jim Hamilton will be talking here. He's going to be reprising the sold-out talk he gave at the New Hope Arts Center a month or two ago. So you'll be able to see it now if you didn't see it then. Telling stories about New Hope area artists who are his friends, as well as his life as a Broadway scenic designer and a restaurateur. And then on April 12th, David Leopold, who's the creative director of the Hirschfeld Foundation and author of The Hirschfeld Century, A Portrait of an Artist in an Age, will be here. He's going to speak and he's going to sign copies of his book, which was one of the top 100 books of the year on Amazon. Great reviews in the New York Times. He was on CBS Sunday Morning, and we're really looking forward to that talk as well. But tonight, you're here to see our speaker, Derek Ostergard. If I were to give you his complete CV, it would take up the entire time we've allotted for his talk. So I can't. I've cut it down sufficiently, so I'll be off the stage in a moment. He is an expert in the history of European decorative arts and design, dating between the late 18th century to the middle of the 20th. He is the former associate director and founding dean of the Bard Graduate School for Studies in the Decorative Arts, Design and Culture in New York City, which he co-founded in 1991. He served on the faculty of the Cooper Hewitt Museum's master's degree program, Sotheby's Educational Board, and is head of the vetting committee for 18th, 19th, and 20th century European decorative arts for the Winter Antique Show in New York. He's curated a score of major museum exhibitions. He's been a board member for many nonprofit institutions, including UNESCO's International Council of Museums. He has served on several international juries for craft and design. I kid you not, this is just a portion. He has lectured on a wide array of topics at museums, institutions, and societies around the world, and he's also a prolific editor and author, publishing extensively on furniture, architecture, glass, porcelain, and jewelry, currently working on 3 manuscripts. Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker of this evening, Derek Ostergard. No. I was waiting for you to come this way. I'm going.
Well, thank you very much. It's an enormous pleasure for me to be here tonight. I used to come down to New Hope years ago when I was working on a project with George Nakashima, and I'm so honored and pleased to see members of the family here tonight. But I have to say it's been many years since I've been down to the area of New Hope and Lambertville, and I'm surprised, at least in driving down tonight with Diana Singer, how unchanged a lot of it still seems to me, at least. They haven't ruined it, like many places. But I'm very pleased to be here to be able to discuss with you something that means a great deal to me, which is the design of objects in France in the interwar era. By interwar era, I mean 1914 to 1939, or if you want to say with the American dates, 1941, when we entered the war. But for me, it was the most creative period of time in the history of man when it comes to objects. A 25-year period of time, a wealth of material was created by a wide array of artists. And tonight, I don't want to just show you those particular pieces, such as this piece by René Lalique, or Van Cleef and Arpels, or Eileen Gray, Jean Dunond, Puy-Forcat, Vionnet, or Maillardin, all these great artists. I hope to be able to leave you tonight. Oh, sure, absolutely, sorry. I hope to leave you, or you, when you leave this evening, on this miserable night outside, that you'll have some greater understanding of why this happened in France and what the circumstances were behind this rapid-fire evolution of design, because in many respects, it was very much a planned occurrence. It had been going on sometime before 1914, but it reached its full flower after the end of the First World War in 1918. Well, if I just give you some idea of France, it's very important to consider one thing. It's where France stood on the European continent. Now, it's a little hard, I hope you can see it, but the slide on the left, the image of Europe, you see France is somewhat of a complete nation up until the third quarter of the 19th century. And then if you look at the slide on the right, which is after 1871, with the consolidation of Germany, which is the light blue state in the middle, you begin to see a simplification of the map. Germany is beginning to rise as a nation, and this is somewhat anxiety-causing for France during this period, as they see it as a major power to challenge them on the continent, as they had held that position basically for the last 150 years under leaders like Napoleon I, even a little bit earlier, Louis XIV, and Napoleon III. Another thing that created a bit of a crisis of confidence for the French was the growth, or the lack of growth on their part, of the colonial empires that occurred in the 19th century as well. Again, if you rely upon the color coding, you'll see that light green area called French West Africa, and then to some degree in the Far East in French Indochina. This is about all the French were really able to grab in a substantial way. The English, obviously, with their Commonwealth of Nations, or the great empire that they produced in the 19th century, and even the Germans, if you look at where they were in southern Africa, got much finer lands. The Sahel, or the Sub-Sahara, which is where the French West African holdings were, really didn't produce that much. And I think they watched with great interest the statistics of nations like Belgium, which, a tiny nation in Europe, controlled the Belgian Congo, which was incredibly rich. The French were not making out like many of their neighboring countries. At the same time, what else produced this sort of anxiety is the rise of England as a great international power during the 19th and early 20th century, with their enormous navy, their army, and also their industrial base. I just have an image of a coal miner, but what they were able to produce, most people would say that England was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. By the turn of the 20th century, it was quite clear who the most powerful nation on earth was. At the same time, the Germans are fast on the rise after the consolidation of their empire in 1871. Just a view on the upper left of the Kaiser on the Unter den Linden in Berlin, and then this great display of some of the great cannons that they began to produce. It was quite apparent to the French that in many respects they were slipping. And the final great power, really, that began to give them something of a sense of discomfiture was the United States. I mean, we were the new nation, much as China today is the new nation. And with the growth of our great cities, our banking empire, this is the old J.P. Morgan property in Lower Manhattan, which still stands, they began to see us as a power on the rise, and we even at that time began to challenge Britain as the great center of industrialism. And I just include this image from the 1930s. This is the River Rouge plant of Ford Motor Company. And this gives you some idea of how things were consolidated in the U.S. River Rouge was painted by many painters, photographed by many people during the period. But the beauty of it is, and I don't know if there is a laser pointer, probably not, I meant to bring one myself. If you look in that white body in the upper right-hand corner, that is the River Rouge coming into this plant. Ore, coke, limestone were coming into this plant. The ships would unload it. It would begin to be turned into steel and other metals, and then they began to produce in different giant industrial sheds the automobile, so that within 28 hours, a car could come from nothing into something. This was really the consolidation of empire in our country, the industrial base. What did France have? Well, they had the past, and the past was very important to the French. I just show you here on the lower left, this is a tapestry of Louis XIV visiting the workshops in the Louvre, looking at some of the great pieces that were produced from the Palace of Versailles. Louis XIV, who was the great leader of the late 17th century of France, was able to sort of consolidate France's position as the great artistic center, but at the same time military and financial center of Europe. And in the upper right, we see Napoleon I, painted by Jacques-Louis David, who increased the empire for a brief period in France's history to an enormous size. So they look back, they say, we were something once. What are we today? Well, we have to look at how they did this, because I do believe it was very much a part of their mentality that we must hold on to what we have. We must build on what we have done. And that began in part through their great educational institutions. This is the École des Beaux-Arts. Any architect working in the United States between 1895 and 1941, when the war began for the U.S., would have probably passed through the doors of the École des Beaux-Arts. And the French and the Germans and the English, too. It was the most respected institution of its kind. There was the Union Centrale des Arts Décoratifs that was founded in 1882, which was a coalition, really, if you will, of museums, industrialists, educators, who all worked together to sort of elevate quality of the decorative arts. There is also the École Boulle. We had nothing like this in the United States. This is a school that in fact taught people how to become fine woodworkers, metal workers, textile artists, and the like. And it still goes on today as an important institution of learning. Another area where they excelled, at least for a while, particularly above the Americans, and we would quickly surpass them in the 20th century, was in the great department stores. There are many books that have been written about the French department stores that rose up in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, all over Paris, but in also some of the regional capitals of the nation. And they became known for being purveyors of all sorts of goods. One must never think the Americans led in this particular respect. They were the great merchants of the era. Another means by which they were able to hold on at least to the collective consciousness of their competitors or peers was through the great expositions that were held in France primarily throughout the second half of the 19th century. You probably all know the Great Crystal Palace exhibition in London in 1851, which is the first true international gathering of these nations from all over the world at these great fairs. And one has to remember these fairs were put together primarily to sell goods, to show that I won awards for the wine that I showed at the great fair. I won awards for the huge guns that I produced for the Navy of Great Britain. Anything that was possible that man could be produced was shown in these giant fairs. The French would fast usurp everyone else in this. They had the fairs in 1855, 1867, 1878, 1889, 1900, more so than any other nation. England only did it twice in the second half of the 19th century, and we certainly had our great fair, the Philadelphia Centennial, which was somewhat of 1876, which was provincial in scale and concept compared to what the French were able to do. The French were also masterful at promoting their goods, their ideas, even to the point where they used the great transatlantic liners like the L'Antique, the Normandy, to sell their goods. And if you look at the lower right, this image, this is an indoor two-story shopping mall that was put into L'Antique in 1932, 1933, where they sold books, clothing, jewelry, anything that was produced by the French, traveled between the U.S. and France, or from France to the U.S., and was sold on these ships. They would never miss an opportunity, whether it was through their posters, their interiors, or the goods that they sold on these ships. Now, there was another coterie, if you will, of important institutions in France, particularly after 1903. The Salon d'Automne, the Salon des Artistes Décorateurs in the middle, and the Union des Artistes Modernes on the far right. These were three institutions that held fairs or they held these shows twice a year, each one of them, to show new textiles, new designs in fashion, clothing, furniture, metalwork, everything, jewelry. And this is just a view of the Salon des Artistes Décorateurs at the Grand Palais. And this just shows you one interior. This is the installation of Jean Dunon's lacquer work on the right. And they also published their own books that came out many times during the year. On the lower left-hand side, this is one of the loose leaf bound folios of the designs from the 1930 Salon, the Fall Salon. But they also had many smaller shows that were held at the Pavillon Marsan on the upper left at the Louvre. On the lower right, this is the exposition for the French modern decoration of silverwork. Tablewares were shown in 1930 in a special exhibition, and they also went far afield. On the lower right-hand side, Cairo, they had an enormous fair showing their goods to the Egyptian community. The upper left-hand side, Anvers, but they'd go to Brussels, all the other fairs. Now, it's important to also add there was a certain impetus or a push forward. This was called the seasonal changes that happened, and that basically happened in couture. And you all know, to this day, magazines and the like promote, in particular, women's fashion. They were on this treadmill of production. So people like Paul Poiret in the lower left that you see here, Elsa Schiaparelli, or on the upper right, Coco Chanel, were always producing new collections. And I have to say that the jewelers, in many respects, followed this motion forward. The furniture makers certainly did. Everyone was working together to just produce. So we have this rapid-fire emergence, if you will, of design that happened many times during the course of the year. This is a view on the upper left of Madeleine Vionnet's shop in Paris. Shop is maybe a modest word for something, her establishment, that was done for her by René Lalique and Georges Dufour. And this is a shot by Steichen on the upper right of Marion Moore modeling some of her clothing, her posters. It was all part of a package. It was called consistency, branding. It was very important to see. Now, here on the upper left is something very interesting. In 1911, you see the Cartier delivery truck in New York City. And they are certainly not going to miss an opportunity to put their name on the truck so that everybody sees it. And we always think, oh, Americans are so crass with their commercialism. I don't believe that's the case at all. I think we learned at the foot of the masters, and the masters were the French at this particular time. On the lower right, you see the interior of a Baker electric car. And I just think it's interesting. I don't know how clearly it appears to you, but it's this exceptionally complete and pleasing interior fittings of this Baker electric were designed by no less of a person than Paul Poiret, the gentleman I just showed you previously. The lighting is noteworthy. They're already branding cars. I remember when I was a young man and they would have Ricardo Montalban and other people sell Chryslers on television designed by different designers. It happened long before that time. Branding literally occurred in the production of furniture. I mean, Mira and Rue and I were talking about this tonight with Kevin about the branding and what you can see and not see on the bottom of the Nakashima table. Well, everyone had a different way of branding their furniture. They were proud of it. They wanted to put their mark on it. What you're seeing in the middle there in that sort of orange burnt stamp is the stamp of Ruhlmann, and it's the back of a Ruhlmann cabinet where it was stamped 3 different times. The lower left, that's a bed that was made for Jacqueline Francel in Paris, and she received, when she purchased it, on the upper left-hand side, they're almost like the papers you would get if you had a dog from the AKC, telling you who made it, where it was made, what atelier it came from, its particulars of this particular piece, stamped inside by Ruhlmann himself. I mean, this is a way to promote, and they were brilliant at this. On the upper left, it's all done in exquisite, multiple layers of lacquer for Jean Dunon, who did the lacquer work for a lot of different ebonistes working in Paris at that time. Below is one of the great mystery clocks by Cartier, and what you cannot see on the lower basis is fait par Cartier, made by Cartier, Paris, London, New York. And then on the right, this is a cabinet by Jules Leleu in rosewood, and if you open the door, he would inlay in his best piece of ivory and take a silver stylus pen and sign his name to it. I mean, it's so effete, but at the same time so wonderful, I think. Ruhlmann, who I've mentioned before, one of the most important figures of the era, in fact, published the Croquis de Ruhlmann, a collection of his own drawings. I mean, this shows you how important he felt he was. And you can see just sketches, simple sketches, but he's helping to push his product along. Even companies like Parfums d'Orsay, this is very interesting to me, they had, over a period of many years, multiple shops all over Paris, Toulouse, Lyon, in the United States, London. And they're one of the first, if not the first, I can't find anybody earlier, who begins to make all their shops look the same, so that when you're in a city, you know that's Parfums d'Orsay that makes this particular perfume. It's just like when we travel. A Four Seasons or a Ritz is going to basically look the same as a hotel. They're very early on in creating this consistent look so that you felt that you knew where you were. Another important aspect of this promotion, the great magazines, and this is just a sprinkling of the many that were produced at this time. The growth of magazines, the promotion of these products came very clearly out of Paris through its magazines to the United States. Then there were also these private companies. This is an Exposicin Decorative on the left, which was a magazine, in fact, called Les Arts, that had its own installations. I mean, I could go for weeks talking about these different institutions, the different artists, but I know you can't see the back, but this is glasswork by Maurice Marino in 1914 being showed, and you can see in the case here some of them on the right-hand side. Everyone was promoting everybody else. People were mixing and working together. Now, at this particular point, you wonder, well, to produce all of this, you need that most important of all ingredients, clients. I'd be curious, does anybody recognize any of these people today? Because most of them have all disappeared from our collective consciousness. This gives me a chance to have a glass of water. Does anyone? These are the most important clients in many respects in France. There are only 4 of 1,000, but these were at the very top. On the upper left is Madame Razuriz from Chile, one of the most important patrons of people like Picasso and Jean-Michel Franck. In the middle, perhaps one of the most important patrons of all French decorative arts, Florence Blumenthal from Park Avenue, New York, who had some of the most incredible Cartier jewelry, furniture by Rateau in her house. She had an enormous house that stood with her husband, built with her husband George Blumenthal at 70th and Park Avenue. On the right is perhaps considered the legendary beauty of the 1920s and 30s, Mrs. Harrison Williams, who was married 6 or 8 times after her husband, no, married 3 times before she married him and 4 other times after, but one of the great patrons of many of the important artists in Paris. And then in the middle and the bottom, just one of the many Indian Maharajas who came to Paris to commission houseboats, palaces in India, jewelry, clothing. It's the Maharaja of Indore in the bottom. Now, something has to help also in this. I mean, I believe in looking at the picture as completely as possible, not just flashing pretty pictures constantly. But you have to understand what helped them. And this is only one chart. for 1925 between May and October. And you can see the steady climb of the German pound, the English pound, and the U.S. dollar against the franc. Basically, the cards were stacked in the favor of the French. They were able to sell like crazy because their products became increasingly less expensive as time went on. Well, it all began to happen certainly before 1914, and I just bring up these two images very quickly of a collar or a necklace by Lalique, which is certainly not looking like his Art Nouveau work of the previous decade. And on the right, a little known, if completely unknown necklace, which I've never been able to find in a contemporary publication that was made for the 1908 Shepherd's Bush exhibition in London, which you see on the bottom. This kind of work, this dynamic, simple work, was quite remarkable. Well, how does it really begin in the mind of many of us? Well, it's this individual here that you see on the left, Jacques Doucet. Doucet was one of the great couturiers, and in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century, really, the couturiers really occupied a position of great power, influence, visibility. And in 1912, up to 1912, he was one of the greatest collectors of 18th century French porcelain, furniture, rugs, glassware, everything. The collection was legendary. And he sold it in 1912. This is the cover of the catalog, Collection Jacques Doucet, Paris, 1912. And taking the proceeds from that particular sale, he began to commission young artists. In particular, the one I show here, Iribe, R-I-B-E, a very strange name that you see, who did all of these interpretations of 18th century French work, but in materials like ebony and shagreen. That's all covered in shark skin, the cabinet on the upper left, the chair. And Iribe was also responsible for being one of the great graphic designers of Paris in the interwar era. He would go on for a period of time, about 8 years, to work in Hollywood for Cecil B. DeMille. You see them together on the upper right-hand side. But he also designed, if any of you remember My Sin, I mean, when I was a boy at least, that was a perfume that was well known. I don't know how many young people even have heard of it at this point. But he did the graphic design working with Rateau on the bottle. And he designed jewelry also, like that wonderful tiara that you see from 1912 on the right-hand side. And I keep saying right, I apologize, because I can't see the screen, so I seem to be playing off of this particular one. In 1914, however, there's a very frightening experience that happens also for the French. They have their first exhibition of German material coming in of the same things that they're doing. Furniture, textiles, interiors. And at this great exposition that you see on the left, this is just one small element of it. There's a certain clarity, simplicity that the Germans have that the French up to 1914 had not really shown. And this will be sort of a frightening call to order. We're just a few months before the actual start of the First World War. On the lower left, this is just looking up towards the Arc de Triomphe on the Champs-Élysées. And on the right, the building you see on the bottom floor, which is probably not clear to you, it says Mercedes, a very frightening thing to the French, because they begin to see the encroachment of their financial situation, of their artistic reputation, on the part of the Germans. And on the upper right, this is from the Deutsche Werkbund exhibition in Cologne in 1914. And with that warlike figure, this is a graphic designed by Peter Behrens, one sees the frightening power that Germany is beginning to project over towards France. Well, the French begin to think we have to look to our own past, our own roots. And so on the right, we see here this photograph by Steichen, the photographer, of Paul Poiret's Stotzi dress. And it's been conveyed or carried over into the Georges Lepape rendering on the left. You can see even the doorway, the sconce that you see on the right has been carried over into the left. This simplicity, they're looking back to their own past. Where are we going to get our ideas to have this cultural, artistic regeneration? This will also happen in part at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées that you see here on the left, which still stands as a very prominent part of the artistic landscape of Paris on the Avenue Montaigne that you see, and that's the interior of the auditorium on the right. It was begun by Henry van de Velde just before the First World War, and because the fact they thought he was a German national because he was working in Germany at the same time, they pushed him out and brought in the Poiret brothers. But this became one of the great centers, the theater, of the promotion of the Russian avant-garde, such as the Ballet Russe that you see here. These are just two renderings by Leon Bakst and Georges Lepape on the left that you see, Bakst on the right, which will have an incredible, shocking influence on the French artistic community. We all have to remember, we hear things today on the car radio. We hear it at home. We can buy any CD. People don't even use CDs anymore. They use, what do you call that one thing that everybody has? I can't even think of it. Well, serious, but there's something that you can put in your house. Everybody has it, but I think we're the less. See, you've all said things I don't even know. Well, you can hear anything you want at any time. I can hear, one night I listened to Vito Sayou, this opera singer. I listened to 15 different recordings she did. Well, in those days, you had to go to the theater. You had to go to the opera to hear these things. Things were new. We are so spoiled by the wealth of material we have. So to see this choreography, I watched Dzerzhinsky's choreography in the Afternoon of a Faun just in preparation for this lecture. It's still somewhat shocking to me. If you go to YouTube, you can see this. But the colors, the richness, the violence, the bizarre qualities, these had a big influence eventually on these people. And why? Well, I think in part they all came to France at that time because they knew it was an open culture. It was welcoming to people. So we see in these different shots, different artists from Eileen Gray in the lower left, from Scotland through England, Fujita on the lower right, from Japan, Le Corbusier on the upper right, from Switzerland, Jean Dunand on the upper left, also from Switzerland. And I'm pulling a complete blank on the gentleman with the beret, but I can move forward, and at least you know something. The influence of the arts on one another at this time, and artistic figures, was incredible. What you're looking at on the left is a Pas de Verre vase, Les Hesperides by Argy Rousseau. And if you look at the figure on the vase, or on this side, and you look at the lower right, this is one of the stills from the Afternoon of Faun, one of the Ballet Russe in Paris. You can see the similarity between her clothing, the set, everything. And on the upper right, that's Lillian Gish in a Fortuny Delphos dress. There was a certain everybody was permeating everyone else's consciousness with these different ideas. Classicism becomes enormously important in these early years to the French. Between 1914 and 1925, the hold that this has on the French never completely divorced themselves from classicism, at least the French I'm talking about tonight. And on the left-hand side is a cast bronze chair. And I'm sorry you can't see this in person, but the back plate that you see and those flexible arms are all cast flounder, fish. This came from the great Blumenthal house on Park Avenue. And I compared on the right to a chair that was done in 1787 for Marie Antoinette by Georges Jacob, the cabinet maker. And you can see there is a strong similarity. The French are looking back, they're picking up their ideas. Even Picasso, if you look at the portrait of his wife Olga in 1917, if you know what he was doing in 1908, 1909, 1910, analytical cubism, synthetic cubism, and you suddenly see in 1917 he's doing representational work like this. And I compare it to the portrait in the Frick collection by Ingres of the Comtesse d'Aussonville that you see in the middle. And on the lower right, this is Suémar, who always said, we are picking up the French traditions from 1840, from the time of Louis Philippe, as though we are a continuation of that 19th century tradition. You know, the painting itself dates from the time of Louis Philippe, the middle one. There is this consistency at first. Sorry, but this gives you a clearer picture. People like Ruhlmann will look back even a little bit further into the period of the mid-18th century, to the period of the Rococo. And on the upper left, you see a corner cabinet called an Uncoigneur. And then in the middle, his wonderful cabinet, of which he did, I believe, 11, in ivory, ebony, and then Amboyna wood. And you'll see throughout the course of this 25-year period, there are even fashions in wood. Amboyna wood you'll see from about 1916 to 1923. Ebony Macassar will be the most popular from the early 20s to 1929. Then it's Palmier du Bois. It's incredible. They are following, in many ways, as I said a little earlier, the constant changes of fashion through the couturiers. Chinese art will be remarkably seductive to many makers. What we're seeing here, in fact, is this, on the upper left and on the middle, a side and top view of one of those wonderful mystery clocks done where the fish, if you can see the goldfish in the lower right of the middle piece, was actually reverse painted on the glass, and as it turns, it points to the hour. And as you've got the chimera or the dragon on the top watching it as it moves around. And on the lower right-hand side, one of the great Chinese mystery clocks by the firm, of which they did quite a few, actually. Eileen Gray on the upper left, deeply influenced by not only the lacquer work coming out of Asia and flowing into France throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, but on the upper right, this is an encore bracelet by by Rémy Boivin that was purchased by many Americans, interestingly enough, I don't know why, and on the lower right, a cigarette case. Egyptian art, equally as plumbed and looted, if you will, in many respects, by the people working in France at this time. I said there's no prejudice to outsiders coming into work, no prejudice against any particular era or period of design. Cartier brooch using an older piece of excavated faience in this particular brooch. And in the middle on the bottom is the interior of 1936 done by Marc Duplantier of an interior based on this sort of metaphysical Egyptian interior. And of course, you all recognize Howard Carter in the upper left, working on the excavation of the tomb of Tutankhamun. And as you probably have all been reading the papers now, there's this great interest that behind these two walls of Tutankhamun's tomb, they believe because of these scans that they're doing, that perhaps Nefertiti's tomb will be behind us, which I think will be one of the great discoveries if indeed it holds true. And on the upper left here, another plaque that was purchased by Mrs. Florence Blumenthal in New York for her house. The Far East, the Middle East, they all had some sort of influence, in fact, on the designers, makers working in Paris at this time. On the upper left, that's the very famous party in 1912 that Paul Poiret gave at his house called 1002 Arabian Nights. And that is a photograph of him with his wife. On the lower left, it's Ida Rubinstein in Scheherazade that was shown, in fact, at the Theatre des Champs-Élysées that I showed you before. In the middle, a wonderful drawing that was done by Sargent of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney in her Paul Poiret Arabian outfit. And on the upper right, it's an invitation to Cartier's shop to see works from the Hindu, the Persian, Russian, and Chinese. And on the lower right, Daisy Fellows, who was a half American through the Singer Sewing Machine family, who was one of the greatest, if not perhaps the greatest collector of jewelry during this period. And this is her wonderful Hindu necklace that was produced for her, I believe, in 1936. Egyptian art would be extremely important. I'm just showing this chieftain stool in the upper left from Zaire, and in the middle, Pierre Legrand's wonderful low table in ebony and Macassar, and ebony itself, and on the right, a stool by Rousseau, low table modeled on a stool. Modern art also influenced the decorative art of this time. The machine age, machine art, as you see from the poster from the Museum of Modern Art on the lower section. On the left is the Tourbillon vase by Lalique from 1925. Even ships, like the Normandy, would influence an individual in the United States or in New York working, Peter Mueller-Monk, and he named his pitcher, his water pitcher, the Normandy. I'm sure this piece comes through occasionally through Rago. Well, the First World War, for those of you who know the war itself, was devastating for the French. Most of the major battles were fought on French soil. Thousands and thousands of miles of roads were destroyed. Entire farmlands completely poisoned and polluted by the war efforts. Canals destroyed, cities, towns, villages destroyed, livestock destroyed, and worst of all, men's lives. And it wasn't until the Treaty of Versailles, and this famous painting of 1919, that normalcy comes back to the French, and then the period begins to take off in an enormous way. This is a wonderful exhibition that very few people ever talk about. I've never seen it, at least in any publications, recent publications. It was a French exposition that was sent over to the Grand Central Palace in New York in 1924. Jewelers, couturier, cabinet makers, and Grand Central Palace stood at 46th to 47th Street at Lexington Avenue. It was our early Javits Center, a large building that was put up just after Grand Central itself was completed. And this show, they're sending their goods out. They're promoting their material to many different audiences. Well, this will culminate in the 1920s in the exposition of 1925, which I'm sure all of you know something or a good deal about. It was an enormous fair, a continuation of those great fairs that had been, in fact, part of the 19th century approach to marketing. And this is the view, if you know, on the upper right-hand corner, this is the Invalides, the Église des Invalides, where Napoleon is buried, stretching all the way across the Seine, in which what may not be clear to you, but if you look at the bridge on the left and look to its right, they had roller coasters, they had tour boats, they had all sorts of things installed. And this was just a small aerial view of this enormous fair. But they had regions of France exhibiting their wares. They had the colonies of France exhibiting their wares. They had French manufacturers, but they also had almost every other nation possible exhibiting in Paris in that spring or summer of and fall of 1925, with the exception of the Germans, who they did not want to be exhibiting on their lands after the First World War, and the Americans, who under Herbert Hoover said, no, I don't think that we really have enough that's modern that we can contribute to this great exposition, which was somewhat true if you look at what we were producing, but that also denigrates the contribution of people like Frank Lloyd Wright and the rest. This is looking for the church, from the church across. This gives you some greater idea, I think, of the scale of these huge temporary sheds that had enormous installations and then spreading out along the river and on the other side of the river that went on for 4 months. This is the national manufactory of Sèvres, a color view of it on the left. And it was an important pavilion because Sèvres was deeply tied since the time of Louis XV in the 1750s with the French identity, if you will. And this is just a view of what they had here, a little magazine article on the lower right. And on the left is a pair of these table urns that were purchased by John D. Rockefeller and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller when they visited the fair in 1925. It would be wonderful to be able to somehow see what Americans bought in general and brought back as what they thought was worthy of their interest. This is another view looking towards the Grand and the Petit Palais, and these are the department stores that lined here. And this is another very interesting thing. They had buses to take you to the department stores. They gave you discount coupons if you went into the department stores, if you picked them up at the fair. They showed their clothing, the furniture that they had. As wonderful as this all is, it's a selling opportunity, and one has to somehow recognize that these were objects that people came to buy. This is the Gallery Lafayette installation. There were enormous interiors. This is Ruhlmann. Ruhlmann was one of the few individuals who had his own pavilion, and this is the pavilion of a rich collector. I mean, he didn't mince his words at all. It was meant to be a view of the house of a very wealthy man. And the interiors were lavish, lush, rich, decorated not only by himself, but working with different colleagues. Jean Dunon, he was responsible for the cabinet on the lower right, but Jean Dunon decorated it in lacquer, and it had 2 sets of doors. This is Jean Dupas' painting to give you some sense of the color, because tragically, oftentimes, we look at black and white photographs and have no sense of the richness of these interiors, as dynamic as they might look in black and white. This is the great Pleyel piano that you see there, done in amboyna and sycamore wood, and then a center table. The Met has one like this, the Brooklyn Museum. You'll see, I also believe that the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts also has an example of this particular table. This wonderful pair of cabinets that the Metropolitan Museum actually purchased from the pavilion in 1925, and are part of the permanent collection at the museum today. The bridge is crossing the Seine, if you can see. It's probably not very clear to you, but shops lined all the bridges on both sides. Any square inch that they could use to promote the product, the modernist products of France, they used during this particular time. This is Jean Luce's booth on the right on the bridge. He was a glass and ceramics manufacturer who sent out a great deal of things to the United States, to department stores here. Well, we begin to see that perhaps it's certainly not a style. It's not a movement because there is no manifesto. It really is just a mindset. How do we produce something that's modern, that expresses our age, that perhaps may utilize the talents of people not from France, may look to the past, may look to the present, the machine age. This is number 8, Rue Monsieur, the music room of Cole Porter and his wife Linda Porter in the 7th arrondissement in Paris, and it was done by Rateau for them. Simple, sparse, elegant, all done in black, silver, gray, and mirrors. But at the same time, there are other tastes operating. This is just what I want to quickly show you through these images. Jacques Doucet, who I mentioned before, who sold his collection in 1912, his collection of 18th century material. And the type of material he commissioned at that time, 1913, 1914, 1915, were pieces like the Aribe cabinets you see in the upper left in shark skin and black lacquer. He began to change his taste dramatically by 1924 and 1925. He was commissioning artists who produced some of the most beautiful book bindings. The Metropolitan Museum, the New York Public Library, are just among many of the institutions that now have portions of his book collection with these fantastically tooled modernist bindings. But he moves to the Rue Saint-Jean in Noailles in Paris and builds this wonderful studio, excuse me, and begins to decorate it in such a marvelous way. There is no style, no overwhelming. If you look back for one moment to this is controlled by one artist, one look, simple, flat, neoclassical. You'll begin to see in Doucet's interiors, however, a richness and a diversity that's absolutely incredible. This richness and diversity also, though, includes one of the greatest painting collections produced, or assembled, if you will, in the 1920s. This is Picasso's famous Mademoiselle d'Avignon of 1908, and you can see it hung just in the stairwell of his house, coming up on the upper right-hand side. But he also began to collect not only Egyptian art, but art produced by Parisians in an Egyptian idiom. But look at the interior. I mean, I think that you can say that this is not like the Cole Porter interior. It's eclectic, it's rich, but it's filled with modernist works. It's dense. It's not what we like to think we see in the past, that this is a clear, streamlined, simplified interiors of the period. There were many different tastes in operation. Here's his wonderful interior With furniture, we can tell you almost where every piece is, like the sofa in the foreground and the lower left is at the Richmond Museum right now. It's part of the Lewis collection. The doors used to be at Mr. Chow's on 57th Street in New York City as doors to his restaurant. The snake charmer in the upper left by Donier Rousseau, the painter, is now in the Museum of Modern Art. The Modigliani's, every one of these pictures, we've traced them all. We know where they've all gone. And on the lower right, this is just, this is a chair designed by Pierre Legrand for Doucet. There's a whole other taste in operation, though, primarily under the aegis or the direction of the man on the lower right, Jean-Michel Franck. And this is the exterior of his shop at number 140 Faubourg Saint-Honoré in Paris. He was deeply influenced by the woman I showed you many slides before when I mentioned patronage in the upper left, Madame Eugenia Errázuriz from Chile, who had this incredible taste. I remember in the 1980s seeing these sparse interiors with distressed furniture, whitewashed and then sandblasted. Well, she really, in the 1920s, and even before, at her house in Biarritz, started this particular taste. And she would have an enormous influence on Jean-Michel Franck with his reductivist mentality. He began to work very early on for very important patrons in Paris. This is Charles and Marie-Laure de Noailles in the lower right. She, a member of a very wealthy aristocratic French and wealthy Jewish banking family, who brought great funds into his family, one of the great French families of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. And she inherited her grandparents' house on the Place des États-Unis, which has now become the Musée Baccarat in Paris, in the 16th arrondissement. And together with Jean-Michel Franck, or at their direction of Jean-Michel Franck, they began to decorate the interiors. And the interiors were just absolutely magisterial. Simple, pared down, chromatically, everything was gray, beige, brown. It was different from what we just saw with Doucet's work, equally as modern. The screen around the sofa, done in marqueterie de paille, which is straw that is applied to the screen itself. The carpeting was called tête de nègre, a dark brown color. Lacquer work done with mica. The doors are done in huge, huge doors in bronze, and the walls are all covered in shark skin. Another view of the same interior. And the sofas were covered in very simple, oftentimes terry cloth in many of his interiors. It's so different, everything's pared down. And as he was said to have said, I mean, I don't know if this is true, but when he went to one of his clients finally, when he finished the project for their house, he gave them the keys, and he said, now you can begin ruining it. He felt that what he produced for them was perfection. Don't hang pictures in his interiors. Don't mess them up with family photographs on tables. His work was exquisite, sparse, and pared down, very influential. This is an interior that he did, in fact, for an enormous penthouse in San Francisco for Templeton Crocker in 1928 and 1929. Much the same vocabulary we just saw in the Noailles interior. But look, if you look at the chairs, they have no historic references. They're just simple cubes. The table's very low. Perhaps they're somewhat Chinese and they're feeling these low altar tables. But you see that the whole thing has been reduced really to a wash of no color and simple patterns. If you look at his lighting fixtures, on the left, that's René Lalique. It looks like a standard lighting fixture that many might have in their house. But on the right, that's a piece of anthritic coal that he stuck a light fixture into. It doesn't have its shade right there. And on the right, that's a block of quartz that he hollowed out from the inside and inserted light in. The man's ideas were incredibly rich in a very short period of time. These are some of the cabinets. The one on the upper left, all sheets of mica. And if you know mica's crystalline structure, you can peel it apart into these thin sheets set into bronze work. Here you can see more clearly on the lower right-hand side, this marqueterie de paille. And I used to see it in Paris. You don't see it anymore because I think it's been bought by collectors and they hold on to it very much. But when you walk by this fan, they had to cut, shape, and trim all this. The fan has a kinetic movement. You walk, the light hits it differently, so the fans seem to be swaying or reflecting light as you go by. The slide on the bottom to the left of that, in fact, is mica. And he would back it sometimes against a red background to give it this rich rust color. On the middle, on the top, there's nesting tables, which are before we had Parsons tables, a simple vocabulary you see, are covered in bleached shark skin. And on the upper right, that's an oak cabinet where they just took a chisel and just chiseled away. There's no carved ornament, no inlaid ornament, no fine veneer on it. It's really something so simple. Rollman will continue, as we saw before, who really had his sort of apotheosis in 1925 at the Exposition, to produce these wonderful interiors. And we've seen this man before, the Maharaja of Indore. This is a painting by Boutet de Montbel that was done of him, I believe, in 1932. But this is his student rooms, but they were shown at the 1929 Salon d'Automne, the Salon des Artistes Décorateurs. It was called The Study of a Young Prince. And it was his quarters at the university that they transferred over that Ruhlmann had done for him. The quality of the work, which was absolutely superlative. On the lower right is a commode or a chest that was done by Ruhlmann 1917 to 1921. He did, I think, 5 different examples of this particular piece called the Chariot. And this is done with traditional veneers, inlay, and ivory. On the upper left, however, is what Ruhlmann is doing and exhibited, in fact, in the Maharaja of Indoors Interiors in 1921. This is the desk cargo. It's a huge sweeping form with these glass insets that would hold the papers down. It shows that even his vocabulary is beginning to change by this time. The jewelers participate very much in this, and they are very important, in fact, for a while, apart from the masses of American clients coming over, and to some degree the English, because of the pound being so strong. But the Indians would bring over, and this is not an exaggeration, it's the truth, there's just too many urban legends, but they would bring chests with them from India of jewels, and ask Chaumet, Cartier, all the other major jewelers working, Mauboussin, to reset them in more modern settings and recut the stones if they were awkward and somewhat lopsided. So you have in 27, 28, 29 these large exhibitions, but we see the diversity also in the jewelry being produced just within 6 years that you see here in these different pieces from Paris. The glasswork of someone like Maurice Martineau will go through, like many of the other artists, an incredible sea change. The plate with the cheval or the horse from 1912. 1925, he does these wonderfully acid etch. They keep dipping them in acid to take off the glass layers and then carving them with a wheel. Then by the late 20s and early 30s, his forms begin to simplify to color, and then finally by the 1930s, that simple vase or perfumier that you see there on the right, just chiseled away with an axe to produce these wonderful forms. 1931 will bring one of the last great expositions to Paris. There'll be one more before the war. And this is the Exposicin Colonial. And if any of you go to Paris, I strongly urge you go to the Forest of Vincennes, which is in the southeastern part of the city. And many of the buildings are still standing, not these. But this gives you some idea of the son et lumière, spectacular, theatrical approach the French had to bringing the world to their doorstep. In the depths of the Depression, they recreated Angkor Wat, Moroccan villages, African villages, anything that stood on their colonial empire, they brought to this great exposition, and it had nothing to do with other nations, just their own colonial empire. These wonderful pageants of these Cambodian dancers on the upper left, but they also show things like automobiles on the that you see on the lower left. You have a street in Algeria on the upper right, and on the lower right you have an African village that you see. These were all part of the installation. These interiors still are there in the Forest of Vincennes. On the left by Ruhlmann, you can see this imperial scale if you look at the height of the doorway, and on the right by Eugène Prince with these wonderful frescoes on the wall. Another very interesting thing about the French, which I don't think we would have ever seen in our country during this time, is the collaboration between rivals. And this is a campaign that was in vogue in August of 1931, the same time promoting exotic jewelry from Africa. It says ornaments strange and exotic from darkest Africa influenced Paris jewelry. But this is a collaboration, in fact, between Mauboussin and Van Cleef and Arpels. They were paying for the same ad together. You'd never see Ford and Chrysler do this, or department stores do it today. But in those days, they knew they had to sort of stretch and reach across and work together. By the 1930s, the early 1930s, France is beginning to realize they're slipping as much as the U.S. had slipped already into a severe economic depression. And a private company, but with great support, in fact, from the government, will produce the designs for the most spectacular ship that ever sailed, the Normandy. This is a poster on the left that you see, but on the right is the actual launching of the shell of the ship. It was covered in newspapers on a weekly basis, magazines, and not just in France alone, showing how the ship was progressing. It says here, shell of the largest room on any ship, the dining salon, August 20th, 1932. This is the room that hole in the ship and the hold of the ship became when the ship was completed. The interiors were covered in color photographs and shown all the great cabinet makers, the tapestry workers, the metal workers, the lighting people worked on this enormous essay in design that was finally completed in 35. Well, by 37, this is the last great exposition that will be held anywhere in the world up until the Second World War. And they will use pretty much the same site that they've used for previous fairs along the banks of the Seine. You can see here, this is the river in the middle. It's stretching on the upper portion. This is the Palais de Chariot that you can go to today to the museum. And then on the other side of the river was the Eiffel Tower left over from the 1889 exposition. But you can see regional center, art appliques and métiers d'art, foreign sections. It was an incredible array. This is the museum today of modern art in Paris, but was built as part of the installation. You can see that classicism still reigned supreme by the late 30s. This is just one of the regional villages from central France that they recreate so you can get a flavor of France without leaving Paris. And here is the view of one of the last major buildings, the Palais de Chariot, that's left over from the fair, to give you just some small sense of the scale of this exposition. Thank goodness for color photography by the end of the 1930s. At least we have somewhat of a greater sense of the pageantry of these great fairs. And this is looking across the river. You can see this is all temporary. It lasted from May to October of 1937 and then disappeared after that point. But it was a period of great celebration for the French. Even the Germans were invited this particular time. On the left, that is the pylon for the German pavilion by Albert Speer that you see. Immediately across the esplanade, no more than 100 feet, 150 feet across, was then the Soviet Union's installation, as you see with this huge sculpture, sort of telling us of what might be coming eventually. This is the Air Palace that was showing airplanes, jets, other things that are coming up at this particular time as part of the change in society. There's also one last great movement that we'll see, which is surrealism during this period. And on the left is the great lobster chair. In the middle is Schiaparelli. If you see, she's wearing the famous shoe hat, a fetish work. The hearts, or the lips for her pockets. And on the right, this is the Duchess of Windsor's Schiaparelli dress that was done for her in 1938. Well, why then, if this is so rich and so vital in 1937, 1938, and 1939, will this begin to change? What is the reason why? After the Second World War, this didn't come back really, and certainly didn't come back into the United States in any substantial way. Well, I personally blame the three men on the right of the screen working for the institution on the left. On the upper right is Edgar Kaufman with his mother and father at their family house Falling Water, which you probably all know outside of Pittsburgh. The middle portrait of the man is Henry Russell Hitchcock, and on the lower right, Philip Johnson. And these men banded together against this kind of work, and they wrote against it, that this was for the elite, it was for the wealthy. Kaufman, in the upper right-hand side, came from a very wealthy Pittsburgh family whose income was derived from department stores, and he basically said, this is department store material. It's wrong. He's not right on that. But this is how they sort of established themselves as young art historians in New York in the late 20s and early 1930s. And they assembled exhibitions for the Museum of Modern Art that showed what was even finer, better, more modern than the stuff that I've just shown you. They did exhibitions like International Style on the upper left and the Machine Art Show a few years later. And then finally, the rise of the National Socialist Party in Germany brought over a great many important figures who would contribute greatly to post-war American development. In the upper left, the aristocratic Walter Gropius, the upper right, Marcel Breuer, and in the middle below, Mies van der Rohe, who would change in many respects the urban landscape in the United States during this period. Well, 1939 September brings a real death blow in some respects to the French. We have, obviously, the collapse of the Third Republic and the entry of Hitler into Paris, and this will obviously change the face not just of Europe but the world in years to come. And finally, just as a document of the great tragedy, I mean, there are many ways to document the tragedy of the Second World War. In New York Harbor, you see the Normandy. The Normandy was brought into harbor, requisitioned by the U.S. government, stripped at least, thank goodness, and then one night caught fire with an acetylene torch. And you see it there. This is at 26th Street. The Cunard line is to the right. And it sank. And it basically, in many respects, sank people's hopes for this whole rich period of design that I've just shown you. I hope that I've at least been able to give you, apart from pretty pictures, some sense of how it happened, why it happened, who some of the instigators were. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.